In 1919, Germany lost its overseas colonies through the Treaty of Versailles. For some Germans, this end of empire passed with little notice or was seen as a positive development. For the organized colonialist movement, however, this loss was tragic. Their belief in the centrality of overseas colonialism to Germany and to Germans' identity motivated them to launch a propaganda campaign to convince Germans of this fact that lasted for 20 years until 1943. When the National Socialists came to power in 1933, colonialists believed that the Nazis' irredentism and commitment to overturning the Treaty of Versailles matched their own goals. In March 1933, Erich Dooms, General Secretary of the Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft, welcomed the beginning of the Nazi regime, declaring that it would, quote, finally bring the hour of the Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft. On the one hand, Dooms's prophecy proved correct. Membership in the Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft grew from 30,000 in 1933 to 50,000 in 1936, and blossomed after the unification of all of the colonialist organizations into the Reichskolonialbund in 1936 to reach 2 million by 1941. On the other hand, however, colonialist organizations and their public activities faced obstruction and opposition from parts of the Nazi regime throughout the 1930s until their eventual shutdown in 1943. For the most part, this obstruction cannot be understood as a wholesale critique of colonialism as a system, that is, as a system of territorial expansion, resource extraction, and exploitation. Rather, the critique was of the geographical focus of these public activities, overseas rather than Eastern Europe, and in the context of the Nazi regime's efforts at Gleichschaltung, of the splintering of Germans' attention. The Nazi regime did not prioritize the reclamation of overseas colonies, but at the same time did not reject these claims entirely, providing colonialists with room to maneuver. Within this space, however, some officials objected to these activities as outdated distractions from more important goals. The depth of colonialist leaders' investment in the value of their colonial claims meant that they characterized any opposition as organizational and as surmountable, rather than as a fundamental challenge to their narrative of the centrality of colonialism to Germany and to German identity. Colonialists' persistent navigation of these challenges and their continued rallies, marches, colonial congresses, exhibitions, an extensive range of publications and journals kept the issue of overseas colonialism in public conversation in the Third Reich. For these colonialists, criticism was not absolute, and the end of empire was only temporary. The organized colonialist movement had already struggled to generate, or rather to control, public enthusiasm for overseas colonialism in Imperial Germany. These challenges continued into the Weimar Republic as groups like the Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft tried to motivate the German public. While millions signed petitions in 1919 and political parties across the spectrum, with the exception of the Communist Party, called for the return of the colonies as part of the larger protest against the Treaty of Versailles, this support did not translate into concrete political action. A challenge for colonialists, as had been the case in Imperial Germany, was their elitism and their steadfast assertion of their own authority as interpreters and promoters of overseas colonialism, given their long-term and often personal or professional investment. After 1933, the challenge of public apathy continued. Colonial propagandists spent a great deal of time thinking about how to increase public engagement with the issue of overseas colonies, even while remaining suspicious of the shallowness of this engagement. Colonialist organizations, especially the Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft, saw their goal as not to lobby foreign powers or to put pressure on the German government to reclaim the colonies, but to awaken the German people's, quote, colonial will. Continuing their increased mass propaganda from the late 1920s, colonialists talked of creating a Volksbewegung. In the early years of these efforts, Volksbewegung did not necessarily mean increased membership in the colonialist organizations, but rather a more intensive engagement with the issue of colonies by members as well as the public more broadly. Ernst-Gerhard Jakob, colonialist author and advocate, for example, argued that even everyday non-political activities such as dancing provided an opportunity for colonialist propaganda. Such interpersonal efforts would expand the impact of colonialist message beyond the number of registered members. This one-on-one propaganda, together with other tactics such as display cases, lectures, and journals, was meant to be didactic, explaining the fundamental facts of the former empire and the arguments for Germany's colonial claims to an apparently uninformed public. This was also, I would argue, why the image of the African continent often appears in colonialist visual propaganda, with the former colonies highlighted or outlined, as if to remind the viewer of where they were. In a Germany nearly 15 years after the end of formal empire, colonialists sought to use their expertise as long-term advocates of empire to instruct an uninformed or apathetic German public on the supposed importance of overseas colonies. Colonialists' sense of authority and mission helped them dismiss obstruction of their activities that moved beyond apathy. In 1933, many colonialist organizations indicated their alignment with the regime and their hope that the regime would actively follow through on demands to reclaim the colonies. The Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft, for example, reorganized into Gau, Kreis, and Ortsverbände, matching those of the Nazi Party, and new Nazi members joined the Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft's executive committee. These adjustments, however, did not undermine colonialist sense of autonomy and of the importance of their colonial claims. And while the responses of Nazi Party leaders to their activities were at times contradictory, colonialist propaganda and statements papered over this inconsistency. Point 3 of the Nazi Party's 1920 program, quote, "We demand land and territory, colonies in parentheses, to feed our people and to settle our surplus population," unquote, appeared over and over in this propaganda as colonialists presented this statement of support, itself geographically vague, as immutable. Even statements from Hitler that seemed to downplay the importance of the colonies were, Doms explained in October 1934, only, quote, "an interpretation and implementation of these fundamental colonial demands." The context for Doms' statement was an August 1934 Daily Mail interview with Hitler in which he had described the former colonies as, quote, "costly luxuries even for England." Rather than a rejection of colonial claims, Doms claimed that these statements were evidence of a flexibility in tactics, quote, "which keep the goals in sight even when for the time being it seems to lead away from this goal." To be national means to be colonial, Doms had declared in February 1933, and this sense of autonomy continued through the colonialist organization's second Gleichschaltung in 1933, which resulted in the dissolution of almost all of the organizations and the creation of a unified Reichskolonialbund made up of their former members. Despite the unsuccessful efforts of Heinrich Schnie, the president of the Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft, to hold off this consolidation, the colonialist press presented this Gleichschaltung as either a reaffirmation of the importance of overseas colonialism or merely a matter-of-fact reorganization that did not call into question colonialist independence or narrative. Der Koloniale Kampf, the journal of the Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft, for example, reported on the end of the Gesellschaft in June 1936, explaining that, quote, "nothing is destroyed, everything is maintained, consolidated, accumulated," and declaring that, quote, "the colonial idea never dies, the Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft goes on in the Reichskolonialbund." In this formulation, the colonialist organization's sense of authority and purpose survived this organizational consolidation. In a public sphere coming increasingly under Nazi influence, however, colonialists had to contend with interference, obstruction, and competition from groups that contested the importance of these claims or disputed their access to certain segments of the population. For example, colonialists planned for a week of activities to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the colonial empire in 1934 were hindered by an order disallowing the participation of party organizations. This led to several events, such as radio broadcasts and lectures, being canceled due to concerns about low attendance. Concerned by this obstruction, Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft leaders sought to identify its source, seeing it as the work of either the Nazi Party's Auslandsorganisation, the Volksbund der Deutschen im Ausland, or other organizations in favor of Eastern European expansion, but refusing to entertain the possibility that these measures had come from the very top. To explain this ban, Rudolf Hess, deputy party leader, pointed to the delicate diplomatic situation with Britain that such activities could disrupt. But at the same time, this ban did not prohibit all colonialist activities, and members of the organizations excluded from participating could still do so as individuals. Similarly, the Frauenbund der Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft reported obstruction by the NS Frauenschaft in 1935, including interference when local Frauenbund chapters were founded, notification that the NS Frauenschaft would take over all public colonial events, and even an accusation of police surveillance. The Frauenbund had made efforts to align itself with the Nazi women's organizations, for example, by limiting its membership to German-born women and restricting leadership positions to NS Frauenschaft members. This was not sufficient, however, as, for example, local NS Frauenschaft leader in Gau, East Hanover, informed the Frauenbund that all colonial work would be directed by the NS Frauenschaft. In this case, the source of conflict was not the colonial subject of their work, but rather who claimed access to and authority over the women involved. This conflict was largely resolved in 1936 when the Frauenbund became Abteilung 4, cultural duties, in the unified Reichskolonialbund, but re-emerged in 1940 when the Reichskolonialbund, the NS-Frauenschaft, and the Nazi Party's Auslandsorganisation all took responsibility for the care of Germans repatriated for their former colonies at the start of the Second World War. Rudolf Hess had tasked the Auslandsorganisation with economically supporting the returning colonial Germans, which a report from the Colonial Works subdivision of the Reichsfrauenbund pointed out, meant depriving the Reichskolonialbund of one of its main areas of activity. In the cases of both the Frauenbund and the 50th anniversary of the Overseas Empire, colonialist claims to public space in the Third Reich were contested. Colonialists did not simply accept this obstruction, as seen in the case of colonialist youth organizations after their absorption into the Hitler Youth in 1933. The remnant of these former colonialist groups continued as Kolonialscharen within the Hitler Youth. In response, colonialist leaders sought to reframe the blow of losing their youth organizations as an opportunity rather than a defeat. Heinrich Schnee, president of the Deutsche Colonialgesellschaft, for example, invited the new colonial advisor of the Hitler Youth to join the Reichskolonialbund Standing Committee to, quote, thereby establish a continuous, strong connection with the leading colonialist organizations. Similarly, Kolonialscharen in the Bund Deutsche Mädel were encouraged to discuss the colonies at least once a month. Such efforts sought to reframe the absorption of the colonialist youth groups as providing access to all German youth through the Hitler Youth, rather than a rejection of their colonial focus. Colonialists not only faced competition from National Socialist groups that claimed to organize demographics of the German public, but also continued apathy from this general public. After their consolidation into the unified Reichskolonialbund in 1936, colonialists greatly expanded the membership and public presence of this organization, reaching 2 million in 1941. This success, however, was paradoxical. Through their activities, colonialists reached broader audiences and nurtured their sense of their work's importance, but at the same time, their efforts to create a Volksbewegung revealed the limits of their control over the reception of their propaganda. Colonialists paid a great deal of attention to the form as well as the content of their propaganda, warning of what one propagandist called the public's Versammlungsmüdigkeit, as well as of the danger of kitsch, and colonial kitsch in particular. While colonialists' public presence expanded, it was not always clear that this public presence translated into deep understanding and commitment to colonialism among the German public. 400,000 visitors attended the Dresden Colonial Exhibition over the summer of 1939, for example, but what they took from the exhibition with its indoor displays and outdoor fairgrounds was less clear. One local newspaper, for example, reported on the families who streamed into the exhibition grounds with only, quote, occasional forays into the halls, while another newspaper encouraged visits despite the rain because, quote, the halls with their interesting show offered enough space to take shelter during the short periods of heavy showers, unquote. While colonialists could launch this exhibition with its clear narrative of Germany's colonial claims, they could not control the public's reception of their message. While the Dresden exhibition indicates some continued public apathy, other colonialists also complained about those whose overexuberance did not reflect deep knowledge and commitment. One propagandist, for example, complained in 1937 that, quote, exactly as it became good form after the Machtübernahme to sign with the German greeting, it is recently also good form to speak of the German colonies in every which way. What do these people understand about the colonial idea and colonial necessities? Colonialists, therefore, were ambivalent about the support of a public which many of them saw as often apathetic, uninformed, or merely jumping on the bandwagon of colonial advocacy. A more fundamental problem for colonialists, however, was the tension between their overseas focus and the Nazi regime's emphasis on territorial expansion in Eastern Europe. Like many German nationalists at the time, colonialists supported this expansionist agenda, but also sought to emphasize the uniqueness of overseas colonial territories in order to support these claims. In 1931, Erich Jones had explained the relationship between colonial space and Eastern space, declaring that these goals, quote, were not mutually exclusive, but rather supplemented each other, quote. Such an attitude did not privilege one geographical focus over another, and throughout the Third Reich, allowed colonialists to continue promoting these overseas territories. Not all Nazi Party officials agreed with this assessment, however. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, for example, rejected the idea of an African Heimat in 1933. As the issue of the overseas colonies was, quote, not an urgent and vital matter, unquote, Goebbels sought to limit colonialist propaganda to issues like the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles. Blut and Boden advocates likewise protested colonialist rhetoric that linked colonial claims to this ideology. These critics also charged colonialists with outdated romanticism. The colonial referat of the Hitler Youth, for example, rejected what he called Karl May romanticism, and an article in the Hitler Youth Journal, written under the pseudonym Colonisator Orientis, alleged that focusing on Africa was a rejection of Eastern European settlement. In 1940, once the Second World War had begun, the SS journal Das Schwarze Korps declared that those with, quote, romantic dreams of being, quote, a colonist and pioneer need not turn overseas but could achieve these goals in the newly occupied territories. For these critics, overseas colonies, specifically overseas colonies, belonged in the past. The outbreak of the Second World War strained colonialists' maxim balancing territorial goals. While colonialists had at times linked their overseas claims to the Nazi regime's rhetoric of space in order to keep these claims relevant, they now confronted the reality of territorial expansion in Eastern Europe and the application by some of the concept of colonialism to these spaces. Some colonialists worried about the instability of the word colony. As seen in the Schwarze Korps article, the reality of Eastern European colonization had the potential to replace the need to turn overseas and thereby undermine colonialists' efforts. Discussions ensued about the definitions and application of the term colonization. Should one differentiate between inner, borderland, and external colonization? Was colony in English different than Kolonie in German? Finally, in 1942, the Colonial Policy Office of the Nazi Party attempted internally to restrict the usage of the terms colonies, colonial land, colonial space, and colonial to overseas and tropical territories. Such attempts to control the narrative, which were undoubtedly unsuccessful, indicate colonialist efforts to keep their interpretation of colonialism central to the German public. As should be clear, these critiques of colonialist propaganda narrative did not reject the idea of territorial expansion, but objected to its geographic location. The subordinate status of overseas expansion for the regime and its efforts to control public space extended these critiques to colonialist public activities. Starting in 1941, the Reichskolonialbund came under increasing pressure to cease its activities. The propaganda ministry limited colonialist propaganda to descriptive accounts of the colonies, for example. As colonialists tried to continue their propaganda work into 1942, officials in the party chancellery expressed their frustration, noting that Germans' attention had to be focused on the war effort in the East and that the Reichskolonialbund instead pursued, quote, remote goals. The colonialist organizations were ultimately shut down in early 1943 in the wake of the defeat at Stalingrad. Throughout the Third Reich, the main colonialist organizations and leading colonialists practiced a balancing act between full accommodation to the priorities of the regime and asserting their own importance within these priorities. For colonialists, the centrality of overseas colonialism had to be maintained in their activities and propaganda in order to justify their continued activity and to carve out a space for themselves within the Third Reich. The obstruction of these activities from various Nazi officials and groups focused on organizational turf and geographical focus, and sometimes both. However, the vagaries of the regime's stance on overseas colonialism within the broader diplomatic context, the piecemeal nature of this obstruction, and colonialist persistence in interpreting these challenges as mere obstructions rather than a fundamental critique kept colonialist public activities going until the realities of the Second World War made this balancing act no longer tenable. Thank you.